Hello, everyone. My name's John Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of FIU's Miami Beach Urban Studios, and I'm delighted to be here tonight with you. We started a series, we being Deborah Briggs of the Betsy Hotel and I, on March 30th. We had our first one, and now we're beginning our third series of the Zen and the Art of. We named this as a way to think about how to find our center and how to find our calm in turbulent times, what we thought were very turbulent times in late March, and which continue to be obviously turbulent times today. So the wonderful thing about partnering with the Betsy from the FIU perspective is that the Betsy Hotel has a cultural interest and in a broad variety of the arts, from visual arts, performing arts, and to literature that's shared by FIU and by the Miami Beach Urban Studios in real life. We could walk from one place to the other in about 10 minutes, but now in our virtual setting, we're going to be doing the best we can. So Deborah, do you want to welcome everybody? Thank you for being our partner here.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming. I'm really excited for us to be introducing our next series, Zen and the Art of Writing in America. As a lot of you know, the Betsy's the home of the Betsy Writers Room. And so in addition to the other art forms that John mentioned, literature is extremely important to us from a familial perspective and a community perspective. Before I get into welcoming Pablo, who's near and dear to our hearts as a Miami-based writer whose work is now reaching the world, I wanted to first thank some community partners who make what we do possible. First, I wanted to mention the Miami-Dade Department of Cultural Affairs because over the past 5 weeks, they presented us with a grant and introduced us to the importance of closed captioning and funded our first effort with that. We continue on our own tonight, closed captioning this series with support from the Betsy Community Fund and the Plutzik Goldwasser Foundation. Other partners are the City of Miami Beach, the Ocean Drive Association, and Leslie Goldwasser and Jonathan Plutzik, who are owners of the Betsy Hotel. And finally, I wanted to mention the Knight Foundation. With the Knight Foundation, we started and grew the Writers Room at the Betsy. And through their generosity, I was able to meet a young bilingual writer in Miami. And that partnership transformed what we were doing in literature at the Betsy. The reason I tell you that story is that writer was Pablo Cartaya. And Pablo has a 10-year association with the Betsy Hotel. And so about 5 years ago, we celebrated his departure from the Betsy, and as he prepared to release his first few books. Since then, he has become an award-winning writer whose books have been reviewed by the New York Times, featured in the Washington Post. He's received starred reviews from Kirkus, Booklist, Publishers Weekly, the School Library Journal, and featured on many Best Books of the Year and state award lists. Together with Pablo, we started some exciting programming. One of the programs was called Escribe Aquí, and it had to do with the fact that we live in a multicultural world, and it's uncommon for people from different cultures to get together and share their own work in an interdisciplinary way. So our conversation tonight continues on that theme. His books have really captured that issue and that essence as well. Pablo's writing about 4 young people, about characters that are experiencing what's going on in our world. And so he writes under the young adult banner, if you will, but he also writes for adults. So tonight, I'm really thrilled to welcome him to our first salon in this series. Tonight we'll talk about his work, and then for the next 5 weeks, he will host our subsequent programs. So Pablo, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and let's have a great conversation.
Pablo, before you start, I just want to jump in with 2 things, just logistical. If you'd like to see if anybody would like to see the closed captions, they're at the bottom of your screen. This might be new for you. I love closed captions on almost everything that I watch. So it's down the closed captions and put on show captions. The other thing I was going to say is that we have a partnership with Casa Cuba, with FIU's Casa Cuba, and we're very excited about that. This is another thing special about this series. And the last thing at the end, we hope you all will stay, and we will unmute everybody at the very end. So, and if you have questions in the meantime for Pablo, please forward them to me or to Deborah as the host or co-host, and we will kind of funnel them to Pablo. So. Thanks very much, Pablo. Take it away.
Thank you so much, John and Deb. Of course, you know, I love you and Betsy and, you know, FIU, we go way back also. You know, I actually spent 1 year in FIU as an undergrad before I ventured off to Los Angeles to pursue an acting career. So, you know, and FIU has always kind of maintained a very special place in my heart. So I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the partnership, and I appreciate the continued efforts that you all make for the community. And you know, as I've gone on in my career, I always go back to the Betsy, because it's just one of those places that when you have been embraced by the people there, you feel like you always have a home to go back to. So it's very special for me. It was, you know, Deborah's the kind of person that you go and she asks you something and she's very difficult to say no to. So, you know, when she asked me about this, you know, to say like I wanted to do a series with Zen and the Art of Writing, I really I thought about what does that mean? And I certainly have my ideas about what writing is in this country, and also how to find the Zen, especially in any times living as a Latinx person in this country. And I've had the privilege of going around the country and speaking to many communities and many schools, and seeing what that means to be a Latinx writer, and writing in spaces that are often not heard, and in a voice that is often and has all too often not been heard. So it's, how do I get my head around this idea of Zen and writing in this country? And, you know, as I was ruminating over that, George Floyd happened, and it created a whole new level of my understanding of my place and the type of work that I do, and the partners and colleagues that I have that are Black Americans in this country, and also the way that we see our own work. And I think that I would be remiss if I didn't mention something about that, and because I think it has a lot to do with what writing is and what writing is in this country. We're at a crazy time here, and I don't need to go and tell anybody what they don't already see and hear and read. But you know, I think about a quote that Ibram X. Kendi said: "The only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then to dismantle it." And I think that that's something that we have to continue to think about. You know, I come from a marginalized community in this country. I'm a hyphen, right? And I am Cuban hyphen American, and that comes with certain realities, you know, but I have to stand in front of my Black brothers and sisters and say, I am with you, and I will call it out anytime that I see it. And I think it's important that we all sort of reflect on what that means for us as we go about our daily lives, and we go about interacting in the world that we're living in now. I think it's a crucial time for us to kind of assess how we approach racism with ourselves, and how we can go forward and try and heal this nation in a way that we don't have to keep dealing with this over and over again. And I appreciate just those few minutes that I had to speak about that. You know, I primarily write for young adults and children. I do dabble in the adult field, but I think that the spaces that I write are for young adults. And I I have the first part of my career, I sort of felt that I had to kind of stand on a soapbox and defend that to a lot of people because it's like, oh, you know, how many times have I gotten in my life that it's like, oh, you write for kids, when are you going to write a real book? You know, when are you going to write a serious book and all this? And I at the earlier parts of my career, I kept trying to defend myself. But I have since stopped doing that because writing for children and young adults is probably the most outstanding field of literature that you can possibly endeavor. Why? Because when you are writing for that field, you are building a generation with your voice. You are helping to create a voice for a generation. And I feel a particular honor to be able to write in that voice. Now, most of my books have a blend of Spanish and English. They come from very personal aspects of my own life, the Cuban American experience growing up as a kid here in the United States. They come from my own children's lives and their experiences growing up here. You know, from my parents, from my grandparents. My books all have an abuelita character in them, really strong character who is typically some sort of glue. Sometimes she's not very nice, you know, but sometimes she's great, and sometimes she's overbearing, and sort of I write in those spaces. They're very personal, and when I talk to kids, I go and I say these three things when you ask me what the themes of my books are, and there's three things, and it's family, community, and culture. Family, community, and culture. And what does that mean? Right. And it's an interesting thing because if you think of like the Betsy, you know, you think of FIU even, you know, it's very much community based. Right. And so my books have this very personal feel to them. And yet I can be in Boise, Idaho, and have the entire school district there say, oh my gosh, you're speaking to our community. Right. I can go to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and have all these teachers saying, oh my gosh, you're speaking the story that these kids need to hear. Right. And so it's a really interesting thing that I can write so personally, right? With these ideas of what family means to me, what community means to me, what culture means to me, and yet have this connection and have this um, link around the country. And when I tell you I've literally been around the country, I have in the last 3 years, I've probably visited about 37 states and communities, probably over 100, where I'm speaking about these three things, right? Family, community, and culture. Um, and I think it's important. I think it's good to be able to reflect on what that means for us as a country, but also as a writer. If anybody in the audience is a writer or an aspiring writer, you know, what does it mean to write personal? Right now, of course, there's the personal narrative, there's the personal essay, there's, you know, there's nonfiction that we can delve into, but there's also, what if you're writing fiction? What if you're writing poetry? You know, and as a writer, I think that it is crucial to write from the personal. Even if you're writing about a wizard who's trying to ward off this evil from, you know, that's ravaging his world, it has to mean something. It has to feel personal. And I think that for me, writing in this country, it's personal. It's not, I'm not writing to sell a book. I'm writing to have a voice. So that voice, right, can be shared with others that are like me, that are kids that might have been like me when I was a kid, right, who didn't have those voices, you know. And that's the that's kind of like the ethos of how I present my work, how I go about my work. I go about it extremely personally. The other thing that I've sort of learned, and I think that this, it kind of brings together sort of what I started off with, is this idea of being held accountable for the words that you write. My publisher, I publish with Random House, Penguin Young Readers, and the imprint that I published my last book with is Kokila. Now you can spell it's Kokila. And Kokila, the mission statement of Kokila is centering stories from the margins. So they have a wonderful list, and I was privileged to have my last book, Each Tiny Spark, be part of that initial launch of the imprint, which just launched last year. As a matter of fact, I should have said that. But so centering stories from the margins, what does that mean, right? What is that? What do you mean by that? Well, it's all of these stories around the world, all of what we call the diverse stories, right? But bringing them to the center, right? And what I loved about my experience writing my book for Kokila was that I was held accountable for everything that I wrote, everything that I spoke about. I spoke about the Yoruba culture. I spoke about the child with that had ADHD. The main character in the book has ADHD, like my daughter does. But I was held to a higher standard with everything that I wrote, and my editor went line by line and questioned every choice that I made. Now, to some writers, that might be super annoying. It's like, well, what do you mean? I'm a writer. I don't need to do this. But I go about it differently. I want to be questioned and I want to be challenged. I want to, especially when I'm putting together a work that is for young people. Kids are going to read this. They're going to see themselves. And I think that it's imperative of a writer to make sure that they are doing it right, that they are saying and representing whatever word that they put, that they are representing it true. I mean, we can talk about what happened with the book American Dirt a few months ago. I mean, it feels like there's so many things that are happening over and over and over again that it's hard to keep track. You know, like, oh, we were just in a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, and yet we're all talking about, you know, burning fires and this awful situation with George Floyd. And it just seems like there's so many things that we just like, what's next, you know? And it's, we're living in this sense of like, oh my gosh, what else can we possibly have to contend with? But here's the thing, we have to contend with it all, right? Because something like American Dirt, which happened just a few months ago, right? Somebody paid a white woman a heck of a lot of money to write a book about a border, about a Mexican family on the border, and gave her a lot of money to be the voice of that. That's wrong. That is wrong. I don't care if the book is good or bad. That is inherently wrong. And that brings a failure. That is a failure of the system, right? Not holding us accountable for the words that we write. And so I am very cognizant of the words that I write. I'm Cuban American, but I can't speak to all Cuban Americans. You know, I can only speak to my experiences. I can speak to the experiences that I feel are inside of me and the stories that I want to tell. And even as I write those stories, right, I expect my editor to challenge me. Why did you choose this? And it's hard work, but I do it because I think that ultimately the stories will have a better place for their intended audience. So I've been, you know, going through a lot of the stuff. I mean, you know, I do have a lot of fun in my writing my books. You know, my books do have a lot of humor, and it's interesting because usually in a presentation, I'll usually crack some jokes and laugh and stuff like that. But it's hard for me to crack a joke now. It's hard to laugh, but we have to also find ways to laugh. So a lot of my books have that sort of humor. I call it, I call them, they're kind of like humor with heart, and they sort of tug at this sort of idea that we can laugh, but then there's also moments of sadness, and there's also moments that we have to kind of reflect. And so,
can I just jump in here just for a second? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I realize the closed captioning is just coming to me alone. You guys probably haven't been seeing it. I just wanted to mention that to Tracy so that she might be able to fix that. And I was also going to just, I think these are such powerful conversations and comments. And as I mentioned, I read The Epic Fail of Arturo Zamora, and and in that you describe protest, and you describe people coming out into the street to make a statement, and you talk about how that. And I was wondering if you would be able to kind of set the scene for maybe people who haven't read your
Yeah.
work, for because it was so powerful, and it was kind of teaching younger kids about this moment when people get together as communities to make a difference and to make a
And it's
statement.
not just, I mean, interestingly, it's not just Epic Fail, but yes, Epic Fail is certainly that, and so is Each Tiny Spark. It's about that. But again, it goes back to these three things: family, community, and culture. And what do you do for your community, right? How do you become present in your community? How do you become active in your community? And finding the places where there is there are moments of where it's trying to disrupt or dismantle or encroach on what your sense of community is, and how do we do that? And my stars are kids, right? And it's awesome because the kids are super engaged. They're super engaged in the discussion, and they love that aspect of it. They love the community activism part of it. And the Epic Fail, it's very true. It's very much rooted in standing up when something is wrong. And again, you should look at it in as a whole, right? This is not just a book about a community activism. This is a book about a lot of things, right? And within those things, that is an aspect of it, right? And I think it's important to have that rounded nature of what the experience is, for young readers, especially, but anybody really.
In that book,
Yeah,
it's a moment that so many things come together between the abuela, passing, and the kind of love story coming together. I mean, you pull together so many threads in those moments of tension when everybody's confused about what's going on outside. They know why they're there, but they're not sure what's happening. And uh, I think it's fascinating. It's brilliant, and it was one of my favorite
thank
parts of the
you.
book. So I just wanted to thank you for
Well,
that.
I appreciate that. No, and and thank you for pointing that out. It's actually in all of this, I'm think I could have easily just used that as an example, but I'm kind of like thinking about what's out there, and I'm not even realizing that I'm actually doing that. I did that, so I appreciate you um, pointing that out. And I'm gonna, because I want to open it up for other questions too, if people want. I mean, I think we're good with time, right? We're still. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just how do we find the zen, right? That's the sort of like bringing it back around to it all. Like we're writing, or I'm writing, and maybe you're writing, and how do we contend with what we have to contend with with our words, right? And then how do we find zen? How do we find our peace within that? I mean, I've been drinking kombucha for for the last 30 minutes, um, which I think that there's a couple of things. Number one, writing is hard. Writing is challenging, and like I said before, with my editorial experience, I get pushed a lot. I get pushed hard, but guess what? I'm on 27 different state award lists. I've won big awards. I've had the privilege of going, but so it's not like because I happen to be just a great writer. No, I'm expected to do the work and to work really hard to get it right. And I get super annoyed at my editor sometimes. And I don't know if she's tuned in or not, but I get super annoyed. But I always, always, always listen to what she has to say in a way that because I think that she's really trying to push the best work out of me. And I think that that's an important thing too to realize, is that we can be writers, and this is something I tell the kids too, is like, you could write, but your first draft is not going to be your perfect draft. We'd love for it to be your perfect draft, but it's not. And if you have somebody in your corner, like an editor or a teacher or anybody that can say and kind of hold you accountable for the words that you're writing, I think that's an important way to kind of come to your writing. Um, and then the zen of this all, I look at my kombucha again. The zen of it is, it's in the face of that kid that comes up to you, or to me, that comes up to me and says, "Thank you, gracias." Gracias for writing this. I have a story. I was in York, South Carolina, right? Um, and a really nice community. I mean, it was, you know, Lindsey Graham has a house there. I mean, so that notwithstanding, um, I so I went to this community, a very, very segregated community. Like it was mind blowing to see like that there's like the funeral homes are segregated still. You know, there's black only and white only. And as I was driving through this town, it was very interesting and kind of eye opening. And I get to this school and I go and I do my speech, I do my thing in front of about 800 middle schoolers. Now, if you have a middle schooler, you know you can't mess around because like they will eat you alive if you don't show them respect and you don't make them laugh a little bit and you don't bring it, they're gonna turn on you really quick. I love that about that group, that age group, because they're just brutally honest. They'll tell you when something sucks. And so I did this thing and I did my whole thing, and then, you know, the kids liked it and whatever. And then this one little kid, he runs up to me, right? And he goes, ¿Dónde puedo encontrar tu libro? Right? Where can I find your book? I said, I think it's in the library, dude. He's like this. He runs, doesn't say anything else. He runs, right? The principal walks over to me and he's just smiling, shaking his head, right? And the kid runs back. He's like, no, it's not there. No está ahí, no está ahí. It's not there. It's not there. I'm like, so I just gave him my book, right? The kid lights up, right? And he looks and he goes, Yo soy de Puerto Rico. I'm from Puerto Rico, right? Principal starts crying, right? The little kid, so I signed the book for him or whatever. Principal started, this is my second book, which is called Marcus Vega Doesn't Speak Spanish. It's about a kid who lives in the mainland U.S. and then goes to Puerto Rico to find his dad, who he hasn't seen in 10 years. But this kid, I give him Marcus Vega Doesn't Speak Spanish. And the principal is like kind of teary-eyed a little bit, and he says, you know, after Hurricane Maria, he was displaced and he was sent here with his mom, and he hasn't been back in 2 years. And this is the first time that I've seen him actually speak and get excited about something in 2 years. You want to tell me where I find my Zen? Right there. That's where I find my Zen.
That's a great story, and I have a couple questions from our audience. One was asking you how you found your start. It was kind of how you started publishing, and the other one that I have on deck is, do your kids read? Because you talked about this kid, and do your own kids read?
So how I got my start is so strange. I mean, it takes a whole other. I mean, so I started off as an actor. I went to Los Angeles, left I was actually at FIU for a year. I was in the theater department. I said, I'm leaving. I'm going to make it. I'm going to be the Cuban Matt Damon, you know, and I left with my best friend, and, you know, we got there, we were doing our thing. We're like, yeah, it's great. Got a little bit of work and, you know, realized really quickly how much they were just trying to kind of stereotype me, like kind of pigeonhole me, like, no, you're going to be the guy that cheats on the guy's wife, you know, would cheats with the, you know, or no, you're going to be like the maybe you're nice, but you're really not. You're kind of suave, and you're like the, you know, maybe you're a drug dealer, like things like that. And I was like, okay, well, you know, that's not cool. I don't want that. And then I had some experiences that were a little more nefarious. That was more like, you should change your name because you don't look like a Pablo enough. You should, you know, like, you know, if you had green eyes, it would be a lot easier to cast you, you know, like things like that were a little more difficult. And there are these little tiny microaggressions that exist throughout. And we kind of receive those when we're, you know, people that come from different cultures where we're in the hyphen, right? And I just got a little bit like pissed off about that, and I went and I said, you know what, I'm just going to write my own damn stories, you know, and I'm going to go and do my own thing. And so I spent the next 10 years of my life trying to do my own thing. And of course, that journey took me to, like, when you look at the epic fail of Arturo Zamora, Arturo's a dishwasher. Like, that's what that was a job I did. I was a dishwasher. I worked in kitchens. And then, I went and I worked with Deb at the Betsy for years. And that was a beautiful experience. And my working in kitchens was a beautiful experience. And it was like, but it was always with this mindset of, my stories are going to be my own. And I'm going to put my voice in there. And that's kind of that's sort of what prompted this lifelong journey to be where I'm at right now.
And so how do you balance those stories that you're making with that kind of creativity that you're seeking? Obviously, you're searching for incredibly rich story and finding incredibly rich storytelling material, but you have a huge responsibility, as you were talking. But your own life is kind of, we treat our lives as a different kind of story. It's not like when we have to sit down and write. I mean, some of us do, but not all of us. So, but I don't know, you seem to be dancing with these two kinds of storytelling, and I'm wondering if that.
I mean, dancing with two kinds of story. I mean,
meaning your own story, like dishwashing and things, and you tease out of dishwashing a kind of way to talk about a responsibility, about this guy who's your boss who you don't like in this not you in the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I know I've done that before too. No, I've done that before. I mean,
but it's kind of a lesson about how to deal with somebody who's smelling and older and arrogant and not very nice to you, and then eventually it's like becomes a.
And you in some way you related to it, right, John?
Yeah, of course. I was a dishwasher. Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. You see, are you Cuban?
No.
Okay, so but here we link each other up, right? Here we find some connection together, and that's sort of what it is. And why is that? Why did you highlight that part? And I said that, well, that's from my own experience. And you just shared that you're a dishwasher too, right? Why? Because it's personal, right? Because writing is personal. And sometimes we mistake, oh, well, you write personal, you should just, write a memoir. And that's not true. You can write anything, right? But if it doesn't feel true, if it doesn't write personal, where can I come up with my stories? Well, I've been alive a certain amount of time, right? And I have, experienced a certain amount of things in my life thus far. And I've seen a certain amount of things in my life thus far. And that leads to this feeling that I have, right? And that feeling turns into first really crappy drafts, because I'm usually like, I see something, I want to write about it, and I start it. And then I'm like, I'm onto something, but I know it's crap. And so once that draft, what I call my emotional draft, comes out, then I sit back and I'm like, okay, what am I trying to say? What am I trying to get out here with this story? What I call sometimes like my controlling belief of the character. What is the essence? What is the core of this story? And it's usually one sentence or two sentences long, right? And that's kind of the process. But I have an eternal minefield of stories and ideas, but they're not stories and ideas for the plot. They're stories for the emotion. They're stories for the personal, right? And then out of there, the plot forms.
Right.
I know there's plotters out there, but that's not how I work,
Right.
Like, I just don't do that.
And we had a question that came up while you were talking about how you go from that step to, what was the story of your first break? Like, we're a publisher, where something you thought was really great then was thought to be great by somebody else. And what was that transition like? What was that moment like?
Well, I had published a picture book, really in response to my daughter at the time. She was 1, and she was a cute little face, and she had little curly hair, one little curly hair that was like formed on her head. And I was like, oh, she looks like a cupcake with a little topping swirl. And I wrote a book about a cupcake searching for her topping. And that book got published by Random House. I was like, oh, okay. I started thinking about it.
Who was the one that published that? Who saw the
Random
cupcake?
House?
Yeah, but like Random House isn't like walking around like.
I was working as a catering chef. In New York, and my good friend was a pastry chef. Is a pastry chef, and was one of the best pastry chefs in the country at the time. I mean, I still think he is, but and you know, it's a really crazy story. We were sitting at a, I'll never forget, it was a Beaujolais Nouveau function in Time Warner, in the Warner building, right? And at Per Se, giving all these memories are flashing back. And we're sitting down together, and they happened to sit me next to an editor at Penguin, right? And I turned to her and I was like, hey, you know, she's like, oh, how you doing? I was like, oh, you know, I'm the catering chef here, and that's Martin, whatever. And she's like, oh, really cool. I'm like, yeah, you know, we're writing a book together. And she's like, really? And I said, yeah. She's like, oh, do tell. I'm like, well, and then Martin doesn't miss a beat, right? This is Chef Martin. He doesn't miss a beat. He goes, really, you are? And Martin goes, mm-hmm. We had not spoken about this up to that point, but he was just like, mm-hmm, yeah. And I was like, yeah, it's going to have Martin's recipes, and it's going to have this, and it's going to be, and I go, and I'm thinking maybe it's a kid's book, you know, and they're like, really? Awesome, whatever. And this whole thing. And then I tell Martin afterwards, I'm like, okay, we got to write a book now. So as I was trying to think of the idea to write this book, my daughter, I'm like, oh, cupcake. And it's searching for her topping. And I started kind of coming up with this. I created this whole confectionery world based on Martin's recipes, and then sent it to her, right? About a month later, and then Martin, we were kind of waiting to hear back, and then Martin tells me, hey, you know, one of my best friends is in marketing at this company called Random House. Do you think I should talk to him? I'm like, yes, yes. I was like, give me his number. I'll call him. I'll talk to him. So I went and I talked to him, and I was like, listen, I said, listen, Chris, look, I just want to tell you, this book is already on submission in consideration with Penguin, and they really like it. But since you're friends with Martin and you're friends with me now, like, I'll give you, if you want to see it. Do you want to see it? Yeah, no, let me see it. Let me see it. And he goes and he gives it to the VP of Children's Publishing at Random House. And she calls me like 2 days later. I'm going to give you an offer you can't refuse. I'm signing you up right now. And that was it. That's how it happened. It was
very cool.
Crazy.
Can I throw something in here? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So when Pablo and I were on the road together, one of the projects we did, when I say on the road, in Miami, bringing books to young people in neighborhoods where their schools didn't have libraries and stuff. So Pablo and I went into a few schools, and he would read that book, Tina Kokolina, to classrooms. And, you know, here he is, a male writer, right? And he's written a book about a cupcake. And he, you know, designed all these games where the kids would compete to design whatever topping the cupcake had. And, you know, it was breaking a lot of boundaries in terms of what a man writes about, you know. And then what we found in the classrooms were the little boys were volunteering. They weren't that little, actually. 5th and 6th grade boys were volunteering and vying to be the cupcake topping. I mean, you know, so I got to see sort of firsthand the impact, you know, you can have in a classroom to have a young writer who looks like some of the kids in the room, you know, and writing about things that everybody is familiar with. And really the book is about finding yourself, you know, finding the topping that tells who you are and what you are. So, yeah, I mean, so that book just came, you know, just had a beautiful.
Well, interestingly, just editorially, I'll give you a little bit of tea on that front. Is originally my original draft of that book has Tina Kokolina, which is the cupcake. She's searching for her topping, and she searches all day long. And my original draft was she just never doesn't find it. The day ends and she doesn't find it, and then she looks out to the moon out of her window, and she sees, well, the moon goes up every night, and it still doesn't have its topping, and it's been around forever. So I just have to keep going. I have to keep trying every day. And the editor, my editor, was like, no, she's got to get her topping. This is a little kid's book. She's got to get her topping. But you know what? You know, the biggest criticism of that book is, guess what? The end. The end. That was the biggest criticism. And I'm like, and I think that there's something to be said about that, you know, like but again, like what Deb was saying is that it's a great joy. And I have to say, and I don't know if my mother's on or not, but I have to say my mother, when I was 19 years old, my mother said, I was in LA. I was like, I was on a show. I was on Will and Grace. I was like, great. I was like, do this thing, And my mother tells me, you're going to write for children one day. And it was like the most insulting thing that she could have ever told me in my life. I was like, what do you mean? I'm a serious actor. I'm going to be a serious writer one day and da 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 da. And she goes, mark my words. And it did. And I did one of those things that, like when your mom says something and it annoys you and you're kind of like, really? Really? And sure enough, when I accepted the Pura Belpre Award from the American Library Association, and it was one of the great honors and joys of my life because my grandparents are a huge influence. My abuelos were a huge influence in my life, and the book is dedicated to them. And so I look up and I said, abuelo, abuela, this is for you, as I'm giving my speech in New Orleans. And I go, and yes, mom, you were right. And it's true, like mothers, they're right, okay, fine, whatever. So she, and it's led me on this journey. And it's been really cool, been really, really nice, really interesting. But, as again, just to circle back, as nice as it is, there's work to be done, and I don't want to rest happily on my privilege and on the things that have been afforded to me. I want to do more. I want to do more work. I want to stand and I want to kneel and I want to fight with those who have too long been marginalized. Like, yes, I've been marginalized in my own ways, but it's not enough to be like, to take it as like, oh, this is just my experience, right? I have to make their experience personal as well.
Can I ask you a question about that? That came from one of the people in our community gathering, who asked, and this was just a little while ago, but what it was about the story that you told about the displaced boy from Puerto Rico, that moved him so much. What do you think it was that? Because you just said he got happy, but you didn't say, like, what was it about your story or about you, or
I mean,
do you think,
honestly, I
may
think
not
that,
know, but
no, I mean, no, I mean, you go in there, I go in there and I'm very much myself, right? I go and I speak Spanish like a third of the time. I'm joking, but then I get serious, I'm just real with them, like cause you can't write to a kid, right? You write with them, you write for, you know what I'm saying? Like if you start talking to a kid, I mean, any of us who have children, you start talking to a kid, see what they do to you. I have a 13-year-old girl, like I start telling her something and she's like, talk to me like that. What do you know? So you got to talk to a kid. You got to, you got to be with them and know that you're like, listen, I've been through this experience. I've felt left out before. I have felt less than before, I've had that experience. And so a kid like that, will go and feel a connection, I'll feel a connection. I mean, I can't, I have so many stories like that, from my travels, and it's heartwarming. It's heartbreaking sometimes, like, but it's like almost like they're looking at me as someone who can connect with them. It's like, I got you, I'm with you here. You know what I'm saying? Like we're here together. We've been through this. We know what this is. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I think that's something that's really special. Gives me a lot of joy. It actually, it's heartbreaking to me that I can't visit them. I had to cancel, obviously because of the pandemic. I had to cancel my March, April, and May visits, and it just killed me that I can't be there in front of them with those kids, and just like really talking with them and saying, hey, look, here we are, but I'm trying to figure something out so I can connect with them. But, like I'm keeping writing books,
Yeah.
I turned in a new book recently and I'm working on another one now. So
there's one more question from the audience that from the chat. it's about Spanish-speaking writers who want to publish in the United States. Do you have any advice about how you go about that? What the choices? It says based on demographics, is there a market, or there is a market, but there seems to be very limited choices for authors. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that is still evolving. The answer is it is still evolving, and I'll tell you that there are many Spanish-speaking authors here in this country that are authors that are teaching at American universities, or they're working in America, and it's difficult to find in ways. I have a colleague of mine who was a translator for many years, and was translating from English to Spanish, and also Nahuatl, and was a professor, and now he's an award-winning young adult writer. And is doing that, and now he's sort of writing in the spaces of Spanish and English and all that. So I think that the best answer I can say is that at this moment, write the story that needs to be written, and there are presses out there that do it. I know, like, I'm gonna actually have, so this is the epic fail, but if you look, it's El Épico Fracaso de Arturo Zamora. This is the translation of this book, right? This is the translation of the epic fail, and this came out in January, and this is Vintage Español, which is the Random House, the Spanish imprint of Random House, Vintage Español. So there's that, they are doing it, right? It's just my thing is just write the story, and then once you're done, go out and find your agent, find your editor, and make your voice known. Like, this is necessary. I get all the time. And actually, the reason that this book that was translated is because I told my editor, I'm like, there are people, I go around the country and there are people asking me, is there a Spanish version of this book? And she was smart enough to say, okay, well, let's send this over to the Vintage Español department and see if there's interest there. And they did. They ended up doing it. So there is movement. It's slow, and I want it to be faster, but I think that there is a small space, and I encourage anybody who's writing in Spanish to continue to write, because there's an audience there. We just have to keep building it.
There's another question along these lines from someone who says that they're a Cuban American, grew up in the United States. They're kind of raised by the abuelita. And what do you say to Cubans like me? But they sometimes don't feel so accepted in the Cuban community. What do you say to Cubans like me who've never lived in Cuba or Florida? Have you always felt 100% Cuban?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. That question is so near and dear to my heart. I grew up in New York City, and I ended up graduating high school here in Miami, but I spent 2 years here, and then it was pretty much my whole life in New York. And I felt, while I was in New York, I felt very much tied to this idea of Cuban identity. When I got to Miami, my last 2 years of high school, I felt very displaced in that idea of Cuban identity. I said, well, this is not how I am, though. I have more, my ideologies are a little bit different than what appears to be the consensus ideology here. And I'm like, and I was confused by that. And then, my father was a veteran of the Bay of Pigs. I mean, it's like, very much tied to the Cuban diaspora here from the exile movement here in the 60s, right? And I always felt that sort of sense of like, well, if my dad's in exile, then I, by extension, feel that too. And was reminded when I was here, several times, you're not in exile. You're barely even Cuban. And that hurts. And I felt for a long time, I'm Cuban and I'm American. And I have this sort of hyphen that sort of separates the two. And I think that this, the viewer was, what is the viewer's name? So I don't just say the viewer.
Kristen.
So Kristen says, that, it's like the way that I approached that experience is that I felt like Cuban American, and I kind of just sat in somewhere in the middle, which was like, to me, it was like, I don't fit anywhere. I'm not fully American. I'm not fully Cuban. What am I? I'm just in this little hyphen right in the middle. That's where I sit. And it felt lonely because there's no name in that hyphen, right? You're just by yourself, right? And so there's that sense of almost displacement from your own communities, you know, that you're just kind of like, okay, well, I guess I'm this. But here's what I find is there's a way to look at it as a form of displacement, or there's a way to look at it as a form of connection, right? So I get to claim both, right? I get to be the bridge to both. I get to have access points to both. I don't need to be a full Cuban. I will never be fully Cuban because I wasn't born there, right? I will never be fully American because, you know, there's just by the sheer nature of my parents' birth, right? Where they were born, right? But that's okay. I can live in this space right here and be that bridge, right? And that helped me contend with this idea of not belonging to either.
Well, I'm going to put a bow on that because I got a response from Kristen who said, thank you. I hope you can come to Tacoma to meet my students. I love that answer. So with that, and with the time that we went way over the time that we usually go for these things, I want to first thank you. And I'm going to turn up the unmute everyone to thank Pablo with us. And let me see if I can do that. Let me unmute everyone. I usually have this right here.
Even from Facebook Live also. Kristen Sierra.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Wait.
Did everybody get unmuted? All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate this. This is wonderful, Pablo.
Thank you.
I said I was going to show you. I'm going to share a screen and show the your books, and then we're going to have one more little. So those are the trilogy of books that just make up part, I guess, of your work.
Nice. Those are cool.
And then we're going to have our last words from Deborah, right? About
Yes.
Pablo coming up.
Yes. So thank you everyone for coming. What a lovely evening, hearing Pablo talk about his career. I wanted to remind you that if you'd like to order those books, you can go to booksandbooks.com. Spelled just like I said it, one word, booksandbooks.com. It's our independent bookseller in South Florida. It's actually one of the largest independent booksellers in the nation. So we like to support it, especially during these difficult times when I think their stores are not open. So go to their website and in the search, just put Cartaya and Pablo's books will all come up and you can buy them there. And of course you can buy them anywhere from your favorite bookseller as well. So we're hoping that you're going to join us next Monday night as well at 7 p.m. And you get a sense of Pablo's quite a conversationalist. And so we're prepared to have 5 additional weeks of conversation with all different kinds of writers, and kicking off next week with Dr. Heather Russell. Dr. Russell is a senior associate dean at Florida International University. She has a fascinating background. She's an academic and creative writer. She looks at the intersection of pop culture and academia. And so she's done some fascinating work, and she also lives in between cultures. She's a person of the world. So I really encourage you to join us. And then after that, we have several poets joining us and some other young adult writers. So to find out more, you can go to thebetsyhotel.com. And on our events page, we have all the events listed. And if you're on our mailing list, which you must be because you've RSVP'd tonight, you'll receive updates on these events. So thank you very much for coming. It was a blast. We love you all. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Pablo.
Thank
Great
you.
job.